Marcus Williams was 39 years old and made $58,000 a year restoring other people's memories. He coaxed life back into wood, his hands, stained with shellac and linseed oil, speaking a language of patience and respect. He could look at a splintered chair leg and see the evening it was carved. He could feel the history in the worn finish of a tabletop, the phantom weight of elbows and dinner plates, and generations of laughter. Yet for 7 years, he had not been allowed to sit at the most important table in his life, the one he had personally saved from ruin. The devastating ritual took place every major holiday and most Sunday evenings. He would drive with his wife Tanya in their shared 2015 Honda Civic, a car with 98,000 miles and a slight rattle in the passenger door, to her mother's mansion on South Battery. The house was a 3-story Charleston single, a gleaming white monument to old money and older prejudices, worth at least $4 million. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of lemon polish and Yvonne's 400 a bottle Chanel No. 5 perfume. And inside, in the grand dining room, sat the table. It was a magnificent mahogany Duncan Fife, seating 12, its surface polished to a dark, liquid gleam that reflected the baccarat crystal chandelier overhead. A fixture Yvonne had once mentioned cost $35,000. Marcus knew every inch of that table. He knew the precise location of a butterfly joint he'd inlaid to stabilize a crack, the subtle figuring of the wood on the third pedestal, the way the light caught the French polish he had applied in over 100 whisper-thin layers. He had spent a full year of his life, over 1,200 hours of unpaid labor, restoring it as a gift. And his reward was to be perpetually barred from it. Tonight was Easter Sunday. Through the archway he could see them gathering. Yvonne, a regal black woman with luminous, deep brown skin and a severe, elegant coif, stood at the head of the table, wearing a cream-colored St. John knit suit that likely cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. She was directing the placement of her guests, a collection of Charleston's black elite, doctors, lawyers, and financiers, all draped in quiet luxury. There was Dr. Alistair Finch in his $3,000 Xenia suit, and Mrs. Beatrice Calloway, whose diamond earrings were probably worth more than Marcus's entire workshop. And there was Tanya, his wife, a vision in a lavender dress that cost $850, her elegant twists piled high. She smiled brightly, her laughter mingling with the clinking of wine glasses. She looked completely at home. She never looked at him. "Marcus, dear," Yvonne's voice cut through the air, smooth as silk and just as strong. She didn't look at him, her attention fixed on a server placing a platter of asparagus. "Tanya will bring you a plate in the study." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decree. For 7 years, the study had been his designated dining area. It was a handsome room, lined with leather-bound books that were never read, but it was not the dining room. It was where you put things, and people you didn't want on display. He felt the familiar hot knot of humiliation tighten in his chest. He nodded, his voice a low murmur. "Of course, Yvonne." He retreated into the study and sat in a $4,000 wingback chair, the leather cool against his back. A few minutes later, Tanya appeared, a heavy porcelain plate in her hands. The plate, from a set Yvonne boasted was worth $6,000, was laden with honey-glazed ham, scalloped potatoes, and asparagus. It was the same food they were eating in the other room, but it tasted different here, seasoned with shame. "Here you go, honey," Tanya said, her voice a little too cheerful. She avoided his eyes, her gaze flitting around the room. "Mama's just... you know how she is with guests." He knew. He had been hearing variations of that excuse for 7 years. He watched her turn and hurry back to the warmth and light of the dining room, her laughter instantly rejoining the chorus. He was left alone with the muffled sounds of their celebration. A ghost in his own life, a craftsman whose hands were good enough to build the altar, but whose presence was not holy enough to worship at it. He looked down at his own hands, the calluses and faint scars that told the story of his life's work. He made $58,000 a year. He drove a used Honda. And in this house, that made him nothing more than hired help. He had no idea, sitting there in the quiet gloom of the study, that the foundation of their carefully constructed world was about to crack wide open, thanks to a $15 trade magazine and the truth he had burned into the wood with his own hands. What would you do if the work of your own hands was used to humiliate you? Let us know in the comments below, and stick around to see how a quiet craftsman found his voice not with a shout, but with a receipt. Their life hadn't always been defined by the chasm between his workshop on King Street and her mother's mansion on South Battery. When Marcus first met Tanya, she had been a paralegal with bright eyes and a laugh that seemed to fill their small $1,800 a month apartment in North Charleston. She claimed to love the scent of sawdust that clung to his clothes and the quiet dedication he brought to his craft. He was a man who made things, who found worth in reclamation, and she seemed to find worth in him. He was building his business, Williams Fine Woodworking, from the ground up. His workshop was a cramped, rented space filled with the tools of his trade. A $3,000 saw-stop table saw he'd saved for 2 years to buy, antique hand planes that cost him $400 at a flea market, and jars of pigments and resins. His income was modest, hovering around $45,000 a year back then, but it was honest work, and it was his. They lived a simple life. Dinners were cooked in their tiny kitchen, often eaten while sitting on their second-hand $600 sofa, watching old movies on a television he'd bought on Black Friday for $350. They drove his 2012 Toyota Camry with 187,000 miles on it and dreamed of a day when they could afford a small house with a yard. In those early years, Tanya's mother, Yvonne, was a distant, critical presence, a voice on the phone whose pronouncements on standards and potential were easily dismissed. The table entered their lives 3 years into the marriage. It was a wreck, a piece of family history Yvonne had relegated to her carriage house, exposed to the brutal Charleston humidity. It was Tanya's great-grandmother's table, and when Yvonne announced she was going to have it hauled to the dump, Tanya had protested with uncharacteristic fire. "Let Marcus look at it," she had pleaded. "He can fix anything." Marcus had driven his old Camry to the South Battery mansion and stood before the table. It was in catastrophic condition. The veneer was peeling, one of the 3 pedestal legs was split clean through, and the top was a battlefield of water rings and deep scratches. To anyone else, it was firewood. To Marcus, it was a challenge. More than that, it was an opportunity. He saw a path to earning Yvonne's respect, a way to bridge the gap between his world of sawdust and her world of inherited silver. He would restore this table, not just as a job, but as an offering. "I can bring it back," he told Yvonne, his voice full of a confidence she did not share. She looked at him, then at the decrepit table, a dismissive smile playing on her lips. "Don't waste too much of your time, Marcus. Some things are beyond repair." The double meaning was not lost on him. He spent the next year pouring his soul into that table. He transported it piece by piece to his small workshop. The initial disassembly took a week. He spent $800 on period-correct mahogany veneer from a specialty supplier in Georgia. He spent another $450 on high-adhesion hide glue and clamps. The split pedestal was his greatest challenge. He refused to simply glue it, instead choosing to reinforce it from the inside with a custom-fitted steel rod, a modern concession to permanence, hidden within historical accuracy. That alone cost him $250 in materials and fabrication. Tanya would visit the workshop, bringing him sandwiches and coffee. "It's looking amazing, baby," she would say, tracing the newly smooth surface. "Mama is going to be speechless." He worked on it late into the night. the single bare bulb of his workshop illuminating his focused expression. His hands, usually so steady, would sometimes ache with fatigue. He documented every step in a leather-bound ledger, a habit he'd developed for all his major restorations. He took before photos, cataloged every material used, and wrote detailed notes on his techniques. It was a provenance of his own making. On a hidden surface, the underside of the small, felt-lined silver drawer, he allowed himself a single act of pride. He took his pyrography pen, a $90 tool he used for subtle details, and burned his maker's mark into the wood, a small, stylized MW. It was his signature, hidden from the world, a secret between him and the wood. Finally, after 14 months and over $2,800 of his own money and materials, it was finished. The table was no longer a wreck. It was a masterpiece. The mahogany glowed with a deep, warm fire, the finish so clear you could see the soul of the tree. It was perfect. He hired a professional moving service, costing him $500, to transport it back to the South Battery mansion and install it in the center of the dining room. The day of the reveal, he stood beside it, his heart thrumming with pride. Tanya was beaming. Yvonne walked in, her face an unreadable mask. She circled the table slowly, her fingers trailing lightly over the surface, a $15,000 diamond ring glittering on her hand. Marcus held his breath. "Well?" Yvonne said finally, a cool, appraising look in her eyes. "It's clean." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving the word hanging in the air like a puff of cold smoke. Tanya's smile faltered. "She's just surprised," she whispered to Marcus, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself. "She loves it. I know she does." But Marcus knew. He had seen the look in Yvonne's eyes. It wasn't surprise. It was assessment. She wasn't seeing a gift of love and labor. She was seeing an asset. He had no idea how right he was. That was the day the facade of their normal life began to crack, and the long, slow, devastating betrayal truly began. The cruelty did not arrive like a thunderstorm, but like a slow, rising tide. It began with the first dinner party after the table was installed. It was for Yvonne's birthday, a lavish affair. Marcus had put on his best suit, a simple navy blue one he'd bought for $450 at a department store, a stark contrast to the bespoke garments that filled the room. He walked with Tanya toward the dining room, ready to finally take his seat at the table he had resurrected. Yvonne intercepted them at the arched entryway. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm, her touch light but firm as steel. Her deep brown skin was radiant under the chandelier's light. "Marcus, dear," she said, her voice a low, polite murmur, meant only for him and Tanya. "My college roommate, Judge Henderson, is here with his wife. It's so good to see them. The seating is a bit tight tonight. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the study? Tanya can bring you a plate." Marcus froze. He looked at the table, his table, with its 12 empty chairs waiting to be filled. He saw the carefully arranged place settings, the gleaming silver, the crisp linen napkins. There was plenty of room. "Mother," Tanya began, a faint note of protest in her voice. "It's for the best, darling," Yvonne said, her gaze unwavering. She was not speaking to Marcus anymore. She was issuing an order to her daughter. "We can't just change the arrangements now." Marcus looked at his wife, searching her face for an ally. He saw a flicker of conflict, a brief moment of shame, and then surrender. She dropped her eyes. "It's just for tonight, honey," she mumbled, her hand finding his. "It's not a big deal. We don't want to make a scene." But it was a big deal. It felt like a physical blow. He had poured his heart into that table, and he was being told he wasn't worthy of sitting at it. Humiliation washed over him, hot and suffocating. He nodded stiffly, disengaged from Yvonne's grasp, and turned toward the study without another word. He ate his meal alone, the sounds of polite laughter and clinking silverware from the other room a constant, painful reminder of his exclusion. He thought it was a one-time event, an anomaly born of Yvonne's legendary snobbery. He was wrong. It became the rule. Christmas dinner, he was exiled to the study because a state senator was in attendance. Easter brunch, it was because Yvonne's sorority sisters were visiting. Each time Tanya would offer a weaker and weaker excuse. You know Mama's friends, they're so particular. It's just easier this way, Marcus. Please don't be upset. The most devastating blow came about a year into this new, humiliating routine. It was a simple Sunday dinner, no special guests, just Yvonne, Tanya's uncle, and a cousin. Marcus, tired of the charade, had walked straight to the dining room and was about to pull out a chair. Tanya grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled him into the hallway. Her face was tight with anxiety. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "I'm sitting down for dinner, Tanya," he said, his voice low and strained. "With my family, at the table I built." "You can't," she whispered frantically. "Mother will have a fit." "Why, Tanya, why can't I?" he demanded, his patience finally snapping. "Give me one good reason." Tears welled in her eyes. She looked away, toward the imperious portrait of her great-grandfather hanging on the wall, a man who had made his fortune in shipping and real estate. "Because," she said, her voice barely audible, "because Mama says... She says we don't break bread with hired help." The words struck him with the force of a physical slap. Hired help. That's what he was. Not a son-in-law, not a husband, not the man who had lovingly restored her family's history. He was the handyman, the laborer whose hands were good for fixing things, but too dirty to be seen at the dinner table. He looked at his wife, at the woman who had once claimed to love the smell of his workshop. He saw her mother's values reflected in her eyes. He saw the shame she felt, not for her mother's cruelty, but for his profession, for his $58,000 salary, for his calloused hands. From that day on, he stopped protesting. He would arrive at the South Battery mansion, greet Yvonne with a tight, polite smile, and retreat to the study to await his solitary meal. A cold, silent rage began to build inside him, a pressure vessel of resentment and heartbreak. He watched his wife drift further and further away from him, drawn into her mother's orbit of galas, charity luncheons, and luxury shopping trips. She started dressing differently. The simple, elegant clothes he used to love were replaced by designer labels. A $3,500 Chanel handbag appeared on her arm. She wore $1,200 Christian Louboutin shoes to parties he wasn't invited to. She spoke of trips to Paris and Aspen, trips funded by her mother's generosity, a generosity that never extended to him. He knew his salary couldn't support that lifestyle, and a quiet, unspoken understanding grew between them. Her life with her mother was separate from her life with him. The emotional distance became a physical one. He started spending more nights at his workshop, sleeping on a small cot he set up in the back. The scent of wood shavings and turpentine was a comfort. It was the smell of his own worth, a worth not measured by a bank account or a family name. He would lie there in the dark, thinking of that beautiful, gleaming table in Yvonne's dining room. It was no longer a symbol of his love. It was a monument to his humiliation. It was the price he had paid to learn the bitter truth about the woman he married and the family he had tried so desperately to join. He felt a deep, abiding anger, but he buried it, letting it simmer beneath a surface of quiet resignation. He was a patient man. He knew how to wait. He just didn't know what he was waiting for. Do you think Tanya was a victim of her mother's influence, or was she just as guilty? Share your thoughts, because the evidence that surfaces next will change Everything. The discovery came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day like any other, thick with the humid Charleston air. It was 2:17 p.m. on June 10th. Marcus was in his sanctuary, the King Street workshop, where the world outside seemed to fall away. The air was rich with the holy scent of cedar and old mahogany. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through the large front window, illuminating the organized chaos of his life's work. He had just finished applying a final coat of wax to a 19th century rosewood commode, his movements slow and meditative. He decided to take a break. He wiped his hands on a soft cotton rag, the familiar gesture of 1,000 workdays, and walked over to the small, cluttered desk in the corner. A fresh stack of mail sat beside his half-empty mug of cold coffee. On top was the latest issue of Southern Antiques and Interiors, a glossy trade magazine he subscribed to for $120 a year. It was his window into the wider world of his profession, a source of inspiration and industry news. He picked it up. The cover featured a sprawling Savannah estate. He flipped it open, the crisp pages making a soft rustling sound. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just browsing, letting his mind wander. He passed an article on silver polishing, another on American folk art. Then he turned to page 4, and the world stopped. His breath caught in his throat. His hands, usually so steady, began to tremble. There, filling the top half of the page in a stunning, professionally lit photograph, was his table. There was no mistaking it. He would know it anywhere. He knew the specific, swirling grain of the veneer on the left side, a pattern as unique as a fingerprint. He knew the exact curve of the pedestal legs, a line he had sanded to perfection by hand over the course of a week. He saw the subtle butterfly joint near the edge, a repair he had made so flawlessly that only he would ever notice it. It was his work, his soul, rendered in wood and polish. His eyes darted to the headline, printed in a bold, elegant serif font. The Gadsden Table, a Charleston legacy reclaimed. His blood ran cold. He forced himself to read the text below. The words blurred, then sharpened into a story of breathtaking audacity. The article, written by a senior editor, detailed the incredible history of the Gadsden Table, an alleged 18th century masterpiece commissioned by Yvonne's great-great-grandfather, a prominent Charleston merchant. It spun a romantic tale of the table being passed down through generations, a silent witness to the family's storied history. Then came the final brutal paragraphs. The article stated that the matriarch of the family, Mrs. Yvonne Gadsden, a noted philanthropist and preserver of Charleston heritage, had recently decided to part with the heirloom. It had been sold to a discerning private collector in Atlanta for a significant, undisclosed sum to fund a new wing for a local children's charity. A smaller photo was inset next to the text. It showed Yvonne standing beside the table in her dining room. Her hand was resting possessively on its gleaming surface, her expression one of serene, aristocratic pride. Her deep brown skin looked luminous against her pearl-white dress. The caption beneath the photo read, "Yvonne Gadsden with the family heirloom, shortly before its sale. Photo dated last June." Last June, a year ago. The magazine slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. He sank into his worn-out wooden desk chair, his body suddenly feeling immensely heavy. The air in the workshop, usually so comforting, felt thin and suffocating. He stared at the picture of Yvonne, at her smug, self-satisfied smile. It wasn't just that she had sold it, it was the calculated, layered cruelty of the act. She had taken his gift, his labor, his love, and she had not only sold it for cash, but she had also erased him from its story completely. She had stolen his work and retroactively rebranded it as her own heritage. A Charleston legacy reclaimed. He was the one who had reclaimed it, from a damp carriage house, from the brink of destruction, and the lie about the charity. That was the masterstroke. It painted her as a saint, a selfless benefactor, using her family's history to benefit children. It was a perfect, impenetrable shield of public virtue. He thought of all the lonely meals in the study. He thought of Tanya's pathetic excuses. He thought of the condescending pats on the arm and the quiet dismissals. It all clicked into place, a horrifying mosaic of deceit. They hadn't just been excluding him, they had been actively monetizing his humiliation. While he was eating leftovers in a side room, they were negotiating the sale of his soul in the dining room. A wave of nausea washed over him. But beneath the sickness, beneath the white-hot rage, something else began to form. A cold, hard resolve. Yvonne had made a critical mistake. She thought he was just hired help. She thought he was simple, powerless, a man who worked with his hands and didn't understand her world of influence and image. She had underestimated him, and she had forgotten about the ledger. She had forgotten about the photographs, and she had no idea about the secret he had burned into the wood. He stood up, his movements stiff. He walked over to a locked metal filing cabinet, a sturdy $300 unit he'd bought for his business records. He unlocked it, his hand perfectly steady now. He reached into the back of the top drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. The provenance ledger for the table. He opened it on his desk right next to the fallen magazine. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. And it would not be fought with loud words or angry confrontations. It would be fought with ink and paper, with evidence and facts. It would be a quiet, methodical dismantling of a lie, and the finality would be absolute. The days that followed the discovery were a masterclass in strategic restraint. The rage that had initially consumed Marcus cooled into something far more dangerous, a cold, clear purpose. He knew that a premature confrontation would accomplish nothing. Yvonne and Tanya would deny, deflect, and gaslight him into oblivion. They would paint him as unstable, an angry husband making wild accusations. He needed more than just his ledger. He needed to see the full depth of their deception with his own eyes. He needed them to lie to his face. So he played dumb. He went home that Tuesday evening and acted as if nothing had happened. He walked into the apartment he still technically shared with Tanya. The air was thick with the scent of her expensive perfume. She was in the bedroom, surrounded by shopping bags from a boutique on King Street. She held up a silk blouse, a shimmering piece of fabric that probably cost $500. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice bright. "For the museum benefit next week?" Marcus looked at the blouse, then at his wife. He saw the careless joy on her face, a joy purchased with the proceeds of his stolen work. A year ago. The timeline fit perfectly. The sudden influx of designer clothes, the talk of expensive trips, it all started last summer. "It's nice," he said, his voice carefully neutral. He leaned against the door frame, projecting an air of casual tiredness. "How's your mother? I haven't heard from her in a while." Tanya waved a dismissive hand, her attention already back on her new purchases. "Oh, you know Mama. Busy as always. She's heading up the fundraising committee for the new children's wing at the hospital. It's taking up all her time." The lie was so smooth, so practiced. The children's wing? The detail from the magazine article, repurposed for domestic consumption. He felt a profound, chilling detachment. He was looking at a stranger. "That's great," he said, the words tasting like ash. "She's doing a good thing." He had made a critical mistake in ever believing this woman loved him for who he was. His next move was to visit the scene of the crime. On Saturday morning, he called Yvonne. "Hi, Yvonne. I was cleaning out the workshop and found that old wood lathe part you asked me about a while back. I'm nearby. Can I drop it off?" It was a complete fabrication, but a plausible one. "Oh, of course, Marcus, I'm here," she said, a hint of annoyance in her voice at the unplanned interruption. He drove his Camry to South Battery and parked on the street. He walked up the oyster shell path to the grand front door and rang the bell. Yvonne answered, dressed in a casual but clearly expensive linen pantsuit that cost at least a whopping $500. Her bridge club was gathered in the living room. He could hear their polite chatter. He handed her a small, greasy paper bag containing a random piece of scrap metal from his workshop. "Here you go," he said. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, her eyes already looking past him toward her guests. He feigned a look of confusion, glancing past her into the dining room. "Oh," he said, his voice laced with manufactured disappointment. "What happened to the table?" The space where his masterpiece had once stood was now occupied by a stark, modern glass and chrome table, a cold, soulless piece that must have cost $20,000. Yvonne followed his gaze and let out a small, tinkling laugh. It was a sound he had once found charming. Now it sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, that old thing?" she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She patted his forearm, a gesture of condescending pity. "It was simply falling apart, dear. The humidity, you know. One of the legs practically crumbled. We had it disposed of. Such a shame, after all your hard work." Her friends in the living room had fallen silent, listening. He could feel their eyes on him. They were seeing the poor, simple son-in-law, the handyman whose efforts had sadly gone to waste. They were seeing the narrative Yvonne wanted them to see. "Disposed of," he repeated, letting the perfect note of hurt enter his voice. "I could have fixed it again." "No, no," she said quickly, shaking her head. "It was beyond saving. Truly, it was for the best." He held her gaze for a long moment, letting the weight of her lie settle between them. He saw no flicker of guilt, no crack in the facade, only the cool, polished certainty of a woman who believed she was untouchable. "Well," he said with a sigh, playing his part to perfection, "that's a shame, a real shame." He turned and walked away, the sound of her returning to her party echoing behind him. He had what he needed. He had heard the lies from both of them. He had seen the empty space where his work had been. The stage was set. The quiet satisfaction of what was to come began to build in him, a steady, patient heat. They had no idea what was coming. They had dismissed him as a simple craftsman. They were about to learn that the same hands that could restore a priceless antique could just as easily dismantle a house of lies. Marcus didn't need a lawyer, not for this. The legal system was slow and expensive. What he needed was something faster, more precise, and far more devastating to a reputation built on smoke and mirrors. He needed a printing press. On Monday morning at 9:05 a.m., he picked up the phone in his workshop. He didn't call the main number for Southern Antiques and Interiors. He had spent the weekend doing his research. He called the direct line of the magazine's editor-in-chief, a man named Arthur Abernathy. He got through to his assistant. "Mr. Abernathy's office?" a crisp voice said. "My name is Marcus Williams," he stated, his voice calm and professional. "I am a furniture restorer here in Charleston. I have irrefutable proof of a significant factual error in one of your recent cover stories that constitutes fraud. I need to speak with Mr. Abernathy directly." The words fraud and irrefutable proof worked like a magic key. After a brief hold, a new voice came on the line, deeper and more authoritative. "This is Arthur Abernathy. What is this about?" "Mr. Abernathy," Marcus began, "it's about the article on page 4 of your June issue, the Gadsden Table. I am the artisan who restored that table. It is not an 18th century heirloom. It was a dilapidated wreck that I rebuilt from the ground up in 2019. and I have the documentation to prove it." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Abernathy was a titan in the world of Southern antiques, a man whose reputation was built on authenticity. A fraudulent sale of this magnitude, promoted in his magazine, was a threat to his entire enterprise. "That's a very serious allegation, Mr. Williams," Abernathy said, his voice cautious. "It is a very serious fraud, sir," Marcus countered. "I can be at your office in Charlotte in 3 hours. You will want to see what I have." The meeting was set for 2 p.m. that afternoon. Marcus packed a slim leather briefcase. Inside, he placed the June issue of the magazine, a copy of his business license, and the centerpiece of his entire case, the thick, leather-bound Provenance ledger. Abernathy's office was on the top floor of a glass tower in uptown Charlotte, a world away from Marcus's dusty workshop. Abernathy himself was a stern-looking man in his late 60s with sharp eyes and a perfectly tailored $1,500 gray suit. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, the very picture of editorial authority. He did not offer Marcus a seat. "All right, Mr. Williams," Abernathy said, his tone skeptical. "Show me." Marcus opened his briefcase and laid the items on the polished desk. First, the magazine, open to page 4. Then, next to it, the ledger. He opened the ledger to the first page. There, in stark black and white, were the before photographs. They showed the table in its pathetic state in Yvonne's carriage house, the peeling veneer, the deep gouges, the shattered pedestal leg. Abernathy leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He picked up a pair of expensive-looking reading glasses from his desk and peered at the photos, then at the glossy image in his magazine. The transformation was undeniable. "These could be pictures of any broken table," Abernathy said, testing him. Marcus calmly turned the page in the ledger. "Here's my documented log of the restoration," he said. 14 months of work. Every material is listed, from the specific species of mahogany veneer, sourced from West Africa, batch number 7B, to the brand of hide glue. The total cost of materials was $2,847.52. I have the receipts." He turned the page again. "Here are photographs of the process, the disassembled pedestals, the veneer being pressed, the French polishing." Finally, he turned to the last page. "And this," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "is the owner's acceptance form, dated October 12th, 2019, signed by Mrs. Yvonne Gadsden and her daughter, my wife, Tanya Williams." Abernathy stared at the signatures. The elegant, looping script of Yvonne Gadsden was unmistakable. His face, which had been a mask of skepticism, began to harden into a block of cold fury. He was realizing he had been played. His magazine, his reputation, had been used to launder a lie. "There's more," Marcus said. He pulled a small, high-resolution photograph from a folder. It was a close-up of his maker's mark. "Before I delivered the table, I burned my mark into the wood. A stylized MW. It's on the underside of the silver drawer, a detail no one would know about. I can show you exactly where it is." Abernathy leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Marcus. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a grim understanding. "The collector who bought this piece is Harrison Croft of Atlanta," he said, his voice tight. "He is one of the most respected collectors in the country and a significant advertiser. He believes he paid $74,000 for a piece of American history." "He paid $74,000 for a piece I finished 3 years ago in a rented workshop in Charleston," Marcus corrected him quietly. Abernathy was silent for a full minute, his jaw working. "This is a disaster," he finally breathed. Then he looked at Marcus, a new kind of respect in his eyes. "What do you want, Mr. Williams?" "I want the truth in print," Marcus said simply. "I want my name on my work. I want a full retraction of the fraudulent story. and I want Yvonne Gadsden's lie exposed to the same audience she told it to. Abernathy nodded slowly. If what you say is true, if that mark is on that table, you'll get it. And Mrs. Gadsden will get a great deal more than she bargained for. He reached for his phone. My assistant will book you a flight to Atlanta for tomorrow morning. I'll be coming with you. We're going to pay a visit to Mr. Croft. The strike was executed with the quiet, devastating precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It was not a battle of loud accusations, but of undeniable physical proof. The following day, Marcus, wearing his $450 suit, and Arthur Abernathy, radiating cold fury in a dark charcoal ensemble, landed in Atlanta at 9:30 a.m. A Blacktown car, arranged by the magazine, whisked them to a sprawling estate in the heart of Buckhead, the home of the collector, Harrison Croft. Croft, a man in his 70s with a worried face, met them at the door. Abernathy had already briefed him over the phone, and the man was visibly shaken by the possibility that his prized new acquisition, the centerpiece of his foyer, was a fraud. The table sat in the grand, marble-floored entryway, looking magnificent under a skylight. To any other eye, it was a perfect 18th-century artifact. To Marcus, it was like looking at a part of his own body. He felt a pang of loss, quickly replaced by a surge of grim resolve. The meeting was scheduled for 11 a.m. sharp. In Croft's study, Abernathy placed his phone on the polished desk and dialed. He put it on speaker. After 2 rings, Yvonne's familiar, melodious voice answered. "Arthur, how lovely to hear from you," she said, her tone oozing charm. "Are you thinking of doing that online feature we discussed? I have some wonderful new anecdotes about my great-grandmother and the table." "Something like that, Yvonne," Abernathy said, his voice deceptively smooth. "I'm with a fact-checker, and we just need to verify a few minor details for the archives. The provenance is so fascinating. Can you tell us again about the craftsman who originally built it?" Marcus stood silently in the corner of the room, listening as Yvonne spun her elaborate fictional history. She spoke of a mythical French Huguenot artisan who had fled persecution and settled in Charleston, pouring his old-world skills into this single masterpiece for her ancestor. It was a beautiful story, poetic and utterly false. Croft, listening beside Abernathy, grew visibly pale. "It's a remarkable piece of history," Abernathy said when she had finished. "Tell me, Yvonne, is there any kind of maker's mark on the piece? Anything to identify this craftsman?" Yvonne let out that tinkling, dismissive laugh. "Oh, heavens no, Arthur. Artisans of that period, especially for a private commission of this stature, rarely signed their work. It was considered improper. The quality of the piece was their signature." "I see," Abernathy said. His eyes flicked to Marcus. It was time. "That's interesting, Yvonne, because we seem to have found a mark." The silence on the other end of the line was electric. "What? That's impossible," Yvonne finally stammered. "You must be mistaken. It's probably just a scratch or a mark from a mover." Abernathy gave Marcus a slight nod. Marcus walked out of the study and into the foyer, where an independent appraiser hired by Croft was waiting. With Croft, Abernathy, and the appraiser watching, Marcus knelt before the table. His movements were confident and sure. He ran his hand along the underside of the tabletop until his fingers found the almost invisible seam of the hidden silver drawer. He pressed a specific point on the wooden scrollwork beside it. There was a soft click, and the drawer popped open a quarter of an inch, a feature Yvonne clearly never knew existed. He carefully slid the drawer all the way out. It was lined with the same dark green felt he had installed 3 years ago. He turned the drawer over. There, burned into the dark, aged mahogany of the drawer's bottom, were the 2 letters, M.W. The appraiser leaned in close, a small magnifying glass in his hand. "It's here," he said, his voice filled with awe. Clear as day. A pyrographic mark, MW. Back in the study, Abernathy held the phone up. His voice was now stripped of all pleasantry, becoming a blade of ice. "Yvonne, we have a problem. The mark is a very clear MW. Can you perhaps explain what your great-great-grandfather's initials were?" More sputtering silence. I don't understand. This is absurd." "No, what's absurd is the story you fed my magazine," Abernathy cut in, his voice rising with controlled anger. "Because Mr. Marcus Williams is standing right here next to me in Atlanta. You might remember him. He's your son-in-law." A sharp intake of breath on the other end. "He has a ledger, Yvonne," Abernathy continued, his words like hammer blows. "A ledger from 2019 documenting his complete reconstruction of this table from what he describes as firewood. It contains photographs, receipts, and detailed notes. And at the end, it has your signature, acknowledging receipt of the restored piece. He also has a photograph of this MW mark, which he says stands for Marcus Williams." The silence was absolute now. Marcus could picture her in her perfect, pristine mansion, her world collapsing through the speaker of a $1,200 iPhone. "The sale of this table for $74,000 to Mr. Croft, under the pretense of it being an 18th century heirloom, is fraud, Yvonne," Abernathy stated. "My magazine was used as an instrument in that fraud. Mr. Croft is, I believe, voiding the sale as we speak, and will expect a full and immediate refund." Her voice was a choked whisper. "I can explain?" "No," Abernathy said, his tone final. "I don't think you can." He ended the call. The room was silent for a moment. Then Croft turned to Marcus, his expression a mixture of fury at being duped and profound respect. "Mr. Williams," he said, extending a hand, "your work is extraordinary. You are not a restorer. You are an artist." Marcus shook his hand. He looked at the table, his table, now reclaimed not just in wood, but in truth. The quiet finality he had wished for was settling around him. There had been no shouting, no messy confrontation, just the clean, undeniable weight of a fact brought to light. The lie was broken. The consequences were already beginning to cascade. The fallout was not a storm, but a quiet, systematic demolition. Each consequence was a direct result of Yvonne's choices, a bill coming due for years of arrogance and deceit. The cascade began the moment Abernathy ended the call. First, the financial blow. Harrison Croft's lawyers were mercilessly efficient. Within 24 hours, a formal demand letter was delivered to the South Battery Mansion via courier. It cited demonstrable fraud and misrepresentation in the sale of the table. It demanded the immediate and full return of the $74,000 purchase price, plus an additional $5,000 to cover the costs of appraisal and legal consultation. The letter gave Yvonne 7 days to comply before civil and potentially criminal charges would be filed. The quiet threat of public exposure was enough. The money, which Marcus suspected had already been spent on lavish trips and propping up Tanya's lifestyle, had to be returned. This was not a slap on the wrist. It was a significant financial wound, forcing Yvonne to liquidate assets she never intended to touch. Second, the public humiliation. Arthur Abernathy was a man who valued his magazine's integrity above all else. The next monthly issue of Southern Antiques and Interiors was a masterpiece of journalistic vengeance. Page 4, the exact page where the original lie had been printed, was given over entirely to a piece titled "An Artisan's Signature, the True Story of a Charleston Table." It didn't just retract the previous story, it eviscerated it. The article laid out the facts in stark, unsparing detail. It featured the before photos from Marcus's ledger, showing the table in its ruined state. It included a photo of the MW Maker's Mark. Most powerfully, it featured a large, dignified portrait of Marcus in his King Street workshop. He was pictured with his hands resting on a piece of unfinished wood, his expression calm and confident, his deep brown skin glowing in the warm light of his own space. The caption read, "Marcus Williams, the artisan behind the masterpiece." The article praised his unparalleled skill and integrity and listed his business name and contact information. It concluded with a cold, formal statement. Southern Antiques and Interiors deeply regrets that it was misled by fraudulent information provided by Mrs. Yvonne Gadsden of Charleston regarding the table's provenance. We are dedicated to correcting the record and celebrating the true artists who preserve our heritage. Yvonne wasn't just corrected, she was exposed. In the small, insular world of Charleston's elite, where reputation is currency, she was rendered bankrupt overnight. Third, the social exile. The magazine spread through the community like wildfire. The phone at the South Battery Mansion, which once rang constantly with invitations, fell silent. The charity board overseeing the children's wing, which had never actually received a donation from Yvonne, quietly requested her resignation. The story of her being disposed of the table after Marcus's hard work, which she had told to her bridge club, was now seen in a new, horrifying light. She was no longer a regal matriarch. She was a common swindler who had exploited her own son-in-law. Fourth, the collapse of his marriage. Tanya's reaction was a series of frantic, escalating voicemails left on Marcus's phone, a perfect record of her unraveling. 11:45 a.m. "Marcus, what did you do? Mother just called me. She's hysterical. You have to call me back right now." The tone was one of pure, angry confusion. 1:30 p.m. "I can't believe you went to a magazine. This was a family matter. You did this just to humiliate us. To humiliate me. After everything my mother has done for us." Justification. Blame. A complete lack of self-awareness. 4:09 p.m. "Okay, look, please, just call me. We can fix this. I'll talk to Mama. We'll figure something out. We can give you some of the money, if that's what this is about." The desperate, insulting attempt at a bargain. 9:12 p.m. A choked, sobbing message. "You've ruined everything. My mother's life is ruined. Our life, it's all ruined. Why would you do this?" The final, pathetic breakdown. Marcus listened to them all, one after the other, feeling not anger, but a profound, sorrowful emptiness. He agreed to meet her one last time at a neutral coffee shop on Coleman Boulevard, far from either of their worlds. She looked smaller, diminished. Her 2400 Burberry dress seemed to hang off her, a costume for a life she no longer had. "Why, Marcus?" she whispered, her eyes red-rimmed. "Why couldn't you just let it go?" He took a slow sip of his $3 black coffee. He looked at her, the woman he had once loved so fiercely, and he saw only her mother's values staring back at him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were quiet, precise, and devastating. "For 7 years, Tanya, I ate alone in a study because you and your mother decided I was hired help. You watched her dismiss me, humiliate me, and you said nothing. That table wasn't just wood and varnish. It was a year of my life. It was my gift to you, to your family. It was my love for you, made tangible. And you didn't just let her sell it. You helped her sell it. You helped her erase me. You sold me for a few $1,000s and some nice dresses." He placed his cup down. "The divorce papers will be sent to your mother's house." He stood up, put a $5 bill on the table, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun, leaving her alone with the ruins of the life she had chosen. 2 years passed. The Charleston sun, once a witness to his humiliation, now streamed into a space that was entirely his own. Williams' fine woodworking was no longer in a cramped, rented unit. It now occupied a beautiful, historic storefront on Lower King Street, a space he had bought and restored himself. The front was a gallery, clean and bright, where finished pieces awaited their owners. The back was a sprawling, state-of-the-art workshop filled with the hum of high-end machinery and the timeless scent of wood and wax. The article in Southern Antiques and Interiors had been a cataclysm for Yvonne, but it had been a rocket launch for Marcus. His story, the quiet craftsman wronged by the arrogant elite, his integrity proven in print, resonated deeply. Collectors and designers from across the country began to call. They didn't just want him to restore their antiques, they wanted him to create new pieces, to burn his MW mark into furniture they could pass down for generations. His business, once a modest $58,000 a year operation, was now a thriving enterprise, valued at over $500,000. He had a waiting list a year long and 2 apprentices he was training himself. By the entrance of the gallery, in a custom-built museum-quality glass case, hung the leather-bound ledger. It was open to the final page, displaying the before photos, the detailed notes, and the damning signatures of Yvonne and Tanya. It was the first thing every new client saw. It was not a trophy of his victory, but a testament to his philosophy, that the story of a piece, its honesty and its provenance, was just as important as the wood it was made from. It was a quiet declaration of integrity. Marcus, now 41, was a different man. The quiet anger that had simmered for so long had been replaced by a deep, settled peace. His short locks were now threaded with a few distinguished strands of gray at the temples. The calluses on his hands remained, but they were no longer a source of shame. They were a symbol of his worth. He was no longer alone. He had met Simone, a brilliant black architect who saw the poetry in his work and the strength in his character. She loved the smell of sawdust that clung to his clothes and would often visit the workshop, her fingers tracing the grain of a piece of raw lumber, her eyes full of ideas. She saw his hands not as the mark of a laborer, but as the tools of an artist. Tonight, he was at home in the small, charming house they now shared in the Wagoner Terrace neighborhood. He had built the dining table himself, a simple, elegant piece, made of reclaimed cypress. As he and Simone sat across from each other, sharing a simple meal and talking about their day, the warm light from the overhead lamp fell upon them. There were no other rooms to be sent to. There were no seating arrangements to navigate. There was only the shared space, the easy intimacy, and the quiet joy of a life built on mutual respect. He thought for a fleeting moment of Yvonne and Tanya. He had heard through the grapevine that Yvonne had sold the South Battery mansion and moved into a much smaller condo. Tanya had divorced him and, without her mother's fortune to sustain her, was working as a paralegal again, her designer clothes long since sold. He felt no pleasure in their downfall, only a distant, quiet pity. He had forgiven them, not for their sake, but for his own. Holding on to that bitterness would only be allowing them to take up space in the beautiful new life he had built. True wealth, Marcus had come to understand, is not measured in dollar signs or inherited status. It isn't found in the cold gleam of a $35,000 chandelier or the false front of a South Battery mansion. It's not about the table you own, but about who you are willing to share it with. True wealth is built, not inherited. It is the integrity of your name, the pride you take in your work, and the love you cultivate in the honest spaces of your life. It is the profound satisfaction of sitting down to dinner at a table you built with your own 2 hands, across from someone who sees you for exactly who you are, and knowing you are finally, truly home. What does true wealth mean to you? Is it about the money you have or the character you build? Let us know your story in the comments, and thank you for joining us on Love Beyond Pride.